The telegram arrived at dawn, its envelope cracked and creased, yet the words inside could have shattered mountains. All is lost. No one in Berlin's intelligence network had ever received such a direct, unambiguous declaration of defeat. March 17, 1943 began with frost gripping the streets and chimneys coughing smoke into the pale sky. But inside a dimly lit safe house on Tiergartenstrasse, the air was hotter with dread than any furnace in the Reich. Major Klaus Richter unfolded the message, his hands trembling slightly, eyes scanning the lines that spelled the collapse of Germany's grand ambitions. Reports from the Eastern Front were catastrophic. Stalingrad, the fortress Hitler had boasted would never fall, had crumbled. For Klaus, the implications were immediate and terrifying. The spies he managed embedded across Europe had intercepted communications that left no room for denial. The German forces were being encircled, supply lines annihilated, morale collapsing. Every field report, every secret communique, painted a picture of strategic devastation. Across the room, Greta Müller, a young cryptographer whose skill in decoding intercepted Soviet messages had become legendary within the Abwehr, stared at the telegram with pale, drawn features. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted her glasses, scanning the same line. That caused Klaus to feel as though the walls themselves were closing in. Outside, Berlin stirred as if nothing had changed. Trams rattled over cobblestone, merchants opened shutters, children laughed in the distance. The city went about its morning unaware that its fate and the fate of millions hung on the fragile, hidden intelligence in that room. Klaus's mind raced. He knew the full weight of this information. If the Nazi High Command discovered that their intelligence network had betrayed them even inadvertently, the consequences would be swift and lethal. Every step, every message, every decision would now be a gamble with life and death. Yet, inaction was equally perilous. He could not let this intelligence sit idle. Someone had to act. He glanced at Greta. "We need to verify everything," he said in a low voice. "Cross-reference it. Make sure there are no mistakes." Greta nodded, already moving to her cipher machine. The soft clicks and clacks of the device seemed louder than the city outside, a mechanical heartbeat echoing in the tense silence. They began piecing together fragments from intercepted cables, civilian informants, and battlefield reports smuggled through courier networks. Each piece confirmed the same brutal truth. German forces were in retreat, encircled and faltering. Stalingrad was gone. Every moment they spent verifying the data, Klaus felt as if he were racing against a collapsing clock. The longer they waited, the more German soldiers marched unknowingly toward annihilation. He pressed his forehead to the frosted window pane, staring at the distant horizon where the rising sun barely pierced the early morning fog. "How did we not see this coming?" he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible even to himself. Hours passed as they worked. Greta's eyes were strained, dark shadows forming beneath them from fatigue and worry. Her fingers danced across the cipher machine, translating and re-encoding messages for clandestine dispatch. Klaus meticulously cross-checked every detail, matching Soviet movements against German field reports. Every confirmation deepened the sense of impending doom. And yet, amid the despair, there was clarity. They could no longer operate as if the war were winnable. March 17, 1943, was not just a date, it was a fulcrum upon which history teetered. If they acted, they might save lives, perhaps hundreds or thousands. If they failed, the Reich would continue its blind march into disaster. Finally, Klaus straightened, his back aching from hours bent over maps and documents. He traced the lines of retreat and encirclement with his finger. "We need a plan," he said. "A way to warn those who can still make decisions. The others they won't know until it's too late." Greta paused, looking up from her cipher machine. "The question is, who can we trust?" Her voice trembled, betraying the fear they both felt. The web of loyalty and deception within the Abwehr and Gestapo was tangled, treacherous. One wrong move, One intercepted message, and their lives could end in a cold, silent execution. Klaus nodded, understanding the gravity. We start with the officers we know are reasonable, those who won't blindly follow propaganda. We'll transmit everything: intercepted communications, maps, supply reports. Every detail counts. The morning stretched into afternoon, the room a tableau of tense focus. Pinned maps, stacks of decrypted messages, and scattered intelligence reports formed a chaotic mosaic of truth. Every line confirmed the same devastating reality: Germany's power, once absolute, was crumbling. Klaus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the safe house itself had become a stage for the unfolding of history. Outside, life continued obliviously. Children played in the streets. The tram rattled past, indifferent to the knowledge contained in one small building on Tiergartenstrasse. And inside, Klaus and Greta worked against the invisible clock, racing to collate and transmit intelligence that would ripple across Europe, reaching those few who could act wisely in the coming storm. By late afternoon, the first coded messages were ready. Klaus pressed his fingers against the cold window once more, watching the city bathed in the pale light of a dying winter day. "History is watching us," he whispered, "and we cannot fail." The telegram had arrived that morning as a harbinger of doom. By evening, it had ignited the spark of resistance, of courage, and of truth. March 17, 1943, the day the German spies first understood that the war was lost, had begun not with guns or bombs, but with words on a page, and the heavy, trembling hands of those who dared to read them. By late morning, the safe house had transformed into a nerve center of urgency and quiet panic. Maps covered every wall, pins marking troop movements, encirclements, and retreat lines, while pencil-drawn arrows traced the inexorable advance of the Red Army. The room seemed alive with tension, every shadow vibrating with the knowledge of looming catastrophe. For the spies who had devoted their lives to the Reich, what they were witnessing was unthinkable. The empire they had served with unwavering loyalty was unraveling, not with a roar of artillery, but with the quiet, unstoppable sweep of truth. Lieutenant Fischer, a veteran field agent with close to a decade in intelligence operations, slammed his fist on the wooden table, sending papers fluttering to the floor. "This is madness," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Hitler cannot know. None of this can be true." Greta Müller, her hand still poised over the cipher machine, shushed him. "It's true," she said firmly, though her own voice betrayed anxiety. "The intercepts, the reports, they all confirm it. Stalingrad is gone, and the front lines are collapsing. You've seen the messages from the field. They leave no room for doubt." Klaus Richter rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar ache that came whenever he faced impossible decisions. The spy network he managed had always been a web of secrets, loyalty, and deception. Now, the threads of that web threatened to strangle them. Every agent, every informant, was a potential risk. A single misstep could lead to exposure, capture, or execution. The dilemma was immediate: continue following orders and preserve the illusion of loyalty, or act on the truth and risk their lives to warn those who might use it wisely. Klaus knew what history demanded. Their role was no longer to gather intelligence for propaganda, it was to transmit knowledge that could save lives and, perhaps, alter minor outcome of a doomed campaign. The room hummed with quiet activity. Greta typed rapidly on the cipher machine, translating the intercepted Soviet message into a secure code that could be transmitted to sympathetic German officers. Fischer sorted maps, marking safe routes for couriers who would carry the intelligence across occupied territories. Klaus coordinated the efforts, cross-referencing field reports with intercepted communications to ensure accuracy. Every detail mattered. A miscalculation could mean not only their deaths, but the deaths of thousands of soldiers on the front line. Outside, Berlin moved on, oblivious. Trams rattled over cobblestones, street vendors called out their wares, and children chased each other in the winter sunlight. The city's normalcy was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the safe house. Here, the truth of the Reich's imminent collapse was no longer abstract, it was tangible, pressing, suffocating. By mid-afternoon, the spies had begun identifying officers they could trust, men who were capable of understanding the intelligence without immediately reporting it to the high command. They knew the risk. Hitler's inner circle would not tolerate dissent. Any officer caught acknowledging the truth could face arrest or execution. Klaus, Greta, and Fischer had to navigate a labyrinth of loyalty and paranoia, ensuring their warnings reached the right ears. Each message we send, Klaus said, pointing at a stack of encrypted letters, must be precise. Too vague, and it will be dismissed. Too explicit, and it could end all of us. Fischer leaned back, his face pale. And if it doesn't matter, he asked quietly. If they ignore it like everything else, Klaus met his gaze. Then we've done all we could. Better to try than to be complicit in silence. The afternoon stretched into evening, each moment weighted with uncertainty. Greta paused to rest her eyes, the pale light of the winter sun slanting through frost-covered windows. Klaus studied the maps, tracing the routes of encircled divisions and destroyed supply lines. The picture was grim. Stalingrad was not merely a setback, it was a catastrophe of strategic and psychological proportions. Every German soldier trapped in the ruins of the city was at risk of annihilation. The spies knew that Hitler's propaganda machine would continue to broadcast lies of victory. Newspapers were filled with stories of minor advances and heroic soldiers, while the real events unfolded in secrecy. Yet, the intelligence Klaus and Greta compiled offered a chance to counterbalance those lies, to provide a sliver of truth to those who might act wisely. Late into the night, Klaus made a decision. "We send it," he said, nodding to Greta. "Every piece we've collected, encoded, disguised, transmitted. No one else can stop us." Greta's fingers danced over the keys of the cipher machine, each click echoing like a heartbeat in the tense silence. Fischer folded the maps carefully, hiding them in compartments designed to evade detection. The spies were a ghost network now, their movements precise and invisible, operating in the shadows while the world above them remained oblivious. By the time the first messages were ready for dispatch, exhaustion had settled over the room like a heavy fog. Klaus rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Every encoded message, every careful note, was a potential lifeline or a death sentence. Finally, as midnight approached, Klaus allowed himself a brief moment of grim reflection. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the truths concealed in one small safe house. The telegram that had arrived at dawn, declaring all was lost, had ignited a chain of events that might, just might, change the course of the war for those who were wise enough or lucky enough to listen. March 17th, 1943, was no longer just a date. It was a day that would ripple through history, quietly, invisibly, carried on the hands of those willing to confront the truth when the world demanded silence. Klaus Richter, Greta Müller, and their small network of spies had crossed the line from obedience to conscience. They were no longer simply agents of the Reich, they were bearers of knowledge that could not be ignored. Outside, Berlin's streets glimmered under the pale moonlight. Inside, the room was a crucible of fear, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. March 17 had begun as a day like any other, but for Klaus and his colleagues it had become the first step toward revealing a war that Germany could no longer win. By mid-afternoon, on March 17, 1943, Klaus Richter had made a decision that would forever define his conscience. The intelligence could no longer remain confined to the safe house. Every intercepted Soviet communique, every crumbling supply report, every note from a frightened soldier on the Eastern Front formed a tapestry of disaster. Stalingrad had fallen, and the German army was being methodically encircled. If the Reich's officers remained in the dark, Countless lives would be lost needlessly. Klaus carefully prepared a coded radio message, concise but powerful. He would transmit it to Colonel Reinhardt in Warsaw, one of the few officers he could trust, not blindly loyal to Hitler, but capable of grasping the grim reality. Every word of the message was deliberate. Stalingrad lost. Eastern lines broken. Prepare contingency. Expect encirclement. Advise caution. It was brief, almost clinical, but the weight of those lines pressed on Klaus like the barrel of a gun. Greta monitored the frequencies with tense focus, her hands steady despite the quiver in her stomach. The radio equipment hummed softly, a constant reminder of both possibility and peril. Every transmission carried the risk of exposure. The Gestapo listened, and enemy detection units monitored the airwaves. A single mistake could cost them everything. Klaus took a deep breath and keyed the transmission. The message lasted mere seconds, but in those seconds, the fate of soldiers and civilians across Eastern Europe hung in balance. As he released the key, he closed his eyes, imagining Reinhardt reading it, imagining the ripple effect of that one decision. Meanwhile, Greta worked feverishly to prepare additional messages for other trusted officers. Her mind raced, converting reports and observations into encrypted formats, ensuring that no unintended recipient could intercept or misinterpret them. Each message was a lifeline, but also a deadly gamble. The fate of the Reich, or at least the soldiers who still relied on competent leadership, depended on precision and luck. Across the city, Berlin continued its facade of normalcy. Propaganda broadcasts filled the air, speaking of heroic victories and imminent triumphs. Soldiers marched confidently into battles they could not win. Officers recited plans that ignored the disastrous reality. The contrast between the lies above ground and the truth below was stark. Klaus and his team were ghosts, moving invisibly in the machinery of the Reich, carrying knowledge that could not be acknowledged openly. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Klaus and Greta checked and rechecked transmissions, listening for any sign of response from Reinhardt. Finally, a faint, garbled acknowledgement came through. Received. Acting cautiously. Will adjust deployment. Relief washed over Klaus in a fleeting, dangerous moment. Even partial action could save lives, even if it could not prevent the eventual collapse of the front. Yet, amidst this minor victory, the weight of their task remained. The safe house was no longer just a center of intelligence, it was a crucible of moral choice. Every intercepted communique confirmed the same horrifying truth. Germany's position was hopeless. The Red Army's movements were precise, overwhelming and relentless. Supply lines had been severed, reinforcements delayed, and morale shattered. The German soldiers at the front were marching, blindfolded toward annihilation, and the High Command refused to admit it. In the shadows of the city, Klaus pondered the moral burden of knowledge. They had chosen to act, to warn, to resist passive complicity, but it came at tremendous personal risk. Even with Reinhardt acting cautiously, the safe house could be compromised at any moment. The Gestapo's presence in Berlin was pervasive, their suspicions unrelenting. Any unusual transmission, any unexplained movement, could trigger a deadly investigation. Fischer, ever the pragmatist, broke the silence. "The others will not listen," he muttered, gesturing to the stack of prepared messages. "Hitler's loyalists will dismiss everything as treachery or error." Klaus nodded grimly. "Perhaps, but some will listen, and some may act. That is enough." As night fell over Berlin, the city's streets shimmered under dim streetlights, indifferent to the clandestine storm within. The safe house was tense but focused. Klaus and Greta continued to monitor communications, deciphering new messages, confirming Soviet troop movements, and ensuring that the intelligence being sent remained secure. Each intercepted detail deepened the horror of what was unfolding on the Eastern Front, but it also strengthened their resolve. Knowledge, they understood, was a weapon that could save lives even as the war itself moved inexorably toward devastation. Suddenly, a knock at the door sent them scrambling. Klaus motioned for silence, signaling Greta to extinguish all unnecessary lights. Fisher peeked through a small peephole, eyes narrowing. Outside was a young courier, a trusted agent dispatched weeks earlier, soaked from the rain but carrying more intelligence from occupied territories. Klaus opened the door just enough to retrieve the bundle of reports. The documents were staggering. First-hand accounts of collapsing German encampments, intercepted Soviet plans, and detailed maps showing routes of encirclement. Each piece confirmed the same brutal reality they had already feared. Klaus felt a cold weight settle over him, a mixture of dread and determination. This knowledge, now multiplied and corroborated, could no longer remain secret. Action was not optional, it was imperative. By the early hours of the next morning, Klaus and Greta had prepared the next series of transmissions, extending beyond Reinhardt to a network of officers quietly sympathetic to reason over ideology. Every message was brief, precise, and coded, designed to pierce the web of propaganda while avoiding detection. In the safe house, tension hung thick, like smoke from a dying fire. March 17, 1943, was no longer just the day Stalingrad fell or the day the Eastern Front collapsed. For Klaus Richter, Greta Müller, and their network, it had become the day German spies first acted on knowledge that the Reich could not survive. The first warnings had been sent, the first lifelines thrown across occupied Europe, and the dangerous dance between truth and survival had begun. The city outside remained oblivious. Soldiers marched, citizens slept. The machinery of the Reich continued to churn, blind and arrogant. But in one small safe house on Tiergartenstrasse, history was shifting in silence, guided by courage, conscience, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to accept lies as truth. Even as dawn broke over Berlin on March 18, the shadows of suspicion had already begun to creep through the spy network. One of the newly recruited agents, eager to prove loyalty, had reported unusual activity in Tiergartenstrasse to the Gestapo. Klaus Richter felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The walls of the safe house had ears, and the city itself seemed closing around them. Every map, every document, every coded message could now be a weapon against them. Greta Müller worked tirelessly at her cipher machine, translating and re-encoding the intercepted intelligence into new layers of security. Her hands moved with practiced speed, but her eyes betrayed anxiety. Even the slightest error could compromise the entire operation. Fisher paced the room, the soles of his shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor, scanning the dim corners for any sign of intrusion. "We cannot risk another exposure," Klaus said, his voice low and taut. "Every courier, every transmission must be scrutinized. One slip and everything is lost. Not just the intelligence, us too." As Klaus spoke, he outlined new escape routes and backup plans for the couriers. Maps were folded into hidden compartments in briefcases and hollowed-out books. Messages were compartmentalized, split into multiple transmissions, each carrying only part of the total intelligence. In this way, if one message were intercepted, the entirety of the critical information would remain secure. The stakes could not have been higher. By mid-morning, a grim sense of urgency had replaced fear. Klaus knew the Gestapo was already sniffing closer. Any unusual frequency or delayed response could trigger a deadly investigation. Yet the work could not stop. The front lines were collapsing, and every hour mattered. The spies had to act swiftly, decisively, and invisibly. Suddenly Klaus paused, listening to the soft static of the radio. A faint, fragmented acknowledgement from Colonel Reinhardt crackled through. "Received. Adjust positions. Cautious advance." Relief surged through him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the Gestapo was listening too. The slightest trace of their activity could end them. "By the way, if you are clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe. More awaits just ahead." Klaus exhaled slowly, turning back to Greta. "Every officer who acts on this will have to balance loyalty and survival," he said. "We can only provide the knowledge. How they use it, that is beyond us." The day wore on with meticulous, painstaking work. Spies coordinated couriers in and out of Berlin, briefed sympathetic officers, and intercepted additional Soviet communications. Each new piece of intelligence reinforced what they already knew. The Reich's position was beyond salvage. Supplies were gone, morale was crumbling, and encirclement on the Eastern Front was tightening with ruthless efficiency. In the late afternoon, Klaus and Greta heard a sudden knock at the door. Fischer froze, listening intently. Klaus signaled Greta to extinguish the lamps and move to cover. The knock came again, firmer, more insistent. Klaus motioned for silence, peering through the peephole. A Gestapo officer, trench coat wet from the drizzle outside, stood on the steps, flashlight cutting across the doorway. Klaus's pulse quickened. His mind raced through contingencies. He signaled Greta to remain quiet. Fischer slowly opened a drawer, lifting a false bottom to hide the remaining documents. The officer's boots tapped on the floorboards outside as he paused, sweeping the beam of his flashlight through the room. For what felt like an eternity, silence reigned. Then abruptly, the officer left. Klaus exhaled, feeling the tension leave his shoulders in a rush of icy air. By nightfall, the last batch of crucial intelligence had been dispatched across Europe. Every message, meticulously encrypted and carefully routed, represented a sliver of hope in an otherwise collapsing war. Yet Klaus and Greta understood that hope alone would not be enough. The Gestapo's surveillance continued, the Reich's propaganda machine marched on, and German soldiers at the front remained blind to the truth that had been painstakingly uncovered. The room was heavy with exhaustion. Klaus rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Greta, her hands still poised over the cipher machine, allowed herself a brief moment of rest, but her gaze remained vigilant. Fischer leaned against the wall, staring at the maps, the pins, the retreat lines, each one a silent testament to the destruction unfolding across Europe. In whispered tones they discussed the next steps. Escape routes had been prepared, contingencies mapped, and the most critical couriers briefed on the fastest ways to avoid detection. Klaus knew that survival depended on moving with both speed and discretion. Every second wasted could cost lives, both their own and those of the soldiers unknowingly marching toward death. Outside, Berlin slept under the indifferent glow of moonlight. Street lamps flickered on wet cobblestones, shadows stretching like tendrils across empty squares. Inside the safe house, history itself seemed to hold its breath. Klaus, Greta, and Fischer had done more than gather intelligence. They had chosen courage over compliance, action over passive complicity. They were no longer merely observers of history. They were participants, acting decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. March 17 had begun as a day like any other. By the end of this chapter, it had become a crucible of human resolve. For Klaus Richter and his network, the first warnings had been sent, betrayal had been narrowly avoided, and courage had become their weapon. The war would rage on, blind and indifferent, but within the hidden corridors of Tiergartenstrasse. Truth had found its voice, and for those who listened, it offered the faintest glimmer of hope in a world consumed by lies. By March 19, 1943, the echoes of Klaus Richter warnings were beginning to ripple through the shadowed corridors of the Reich. Colonel Reinhardt had acted on the intercepted intelligence, discreetly repositioning units and adjusting deployments along the Eastern Front. Though small, these measures had already prevented certain encirclements from turning into complete annihilation. For Klaus and his team, it was a rare, grim victory, but one tinged with despair. The larger war would continue to consume lives, and Berlin remained oblivious to the scale of the disaster. Inside the safe house, the tension was a palpable, living presence. Klaus studied maps spread across the table, fingers tracing the routes of retreating units and shattered supply lines. Greta worked silently, decoding new intercepted messages and converting them into secure transmissions for officers sympathetic to reason. Fischer paced, muttering under his breath, the weight of their knowledge pressing on him. Each new report reinforced the inevitability of collapse. Stalingrad had fallen, supply lines were severed, and morale along the Eastern Front had hit rock bottom. Despite the horrors of their discoveries, the spies understood the value of what they had accomplished. Minor adjustments in troop movements, tiny interventions based on their intelligence, could save lives even if they could not reverse the war's trajectory. Klaus felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. Every soldier who survived because of their warnings was a testament to the importance of courage and foresight in times of deception. Even as they worked, Berlin continued to pulse with the familiar, chilling rhythm of propaganda. Radio broadcasts spoke of glorious victories and unbroken fronts, painting a starkly false picture of success. Soldiers marched confidently into areas where the Red Army had already established control. Officers recited orders that ignored the true conditions at the front. Yet, in the quiet, hidden spaces of Tiergartenstrasse, the truth of March 17 persisted encoded, transmitted and acted upon. Fischer stopped pacing and pointed to the newest batch of intelligence. "Look at this," he said, voice tight. "Units trapped near the Don River. If Reinhardt hadn't, he received your message, Klaus. They'd all be dead." Klaus traced the lines with his finger, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "It is only a partial mitigation," he said quietly. "We are saving hundreds, perhaps thousands. But the rest," he trailed off, the weight of inevitability pressing down like a stone. Greta interjected softly, her eyes never leaving the cipher machine. "Even small victories matter. If these men survive, they can warn others, regroup, perhaps even slow the collapse just a little. That is enough to justify the risk we've taken." As night fell, Klaus allowed himself a rare moment to reflect. The terror, the suspense, the constant threat of discovery, it was all real, and it had almost broken them. Yet, the knowledge that their intelligence had saved lives imbued them with grim satisfaction. Even amid the devastation of the Eastern Front and the unyielding arrogance of Berlin, individual courage had left a mark. Outside, the city glimmered under the dim moonlight, oblivious to the lives being quietly preserved within. Klaus, Greta, and Fischer moved carefully, preparing the next set of encrypted transmissions. Each letter, each map, each message was a lifeline. They had become silent arbiters of fate, shaping outcomes invisibly, away from the pomp and spectacle of the Reich's delusions. But the work was not without danger. Reports from couriers indicated that the Gestapo was intensifying surveillance. A small slip, a delayed message, a misrouted courier, could trigger suspicion and bring the full weight of the Reich down on them. Klaus considered the risks carefully. Survival depended on vigilance, discretion, and unwavering attention to detail. In one quiet moment, Greta looked up from her cipher machine, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think Berlin will ever know what we've done here?" Klaus shook his head slowly. "No, they will never know, and perhaps it is better this way. History will remember Stalingrad, the soldiers, the generals, but not the shadows that worked quietly to save lives amid chaos." Fischer leaned against the wall, his face shadowed and tired. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. The lives we save, the risks we take, it feels like a drop in a storm." Klaus turned to him, eyes steady. "A drop in a storm is still water. Without it, there would be nothing. Every life we save matters. That is enough to continue." As midnight approached, the safe house settled into tense quiet. Outside, the streets of Berlin were empty, lit only by flickering lamps reflecting off wet cobblestones. Inside, the spies reviewed every message, every route, every plan, ensuring that nothing could compromise their fragile web of intelligence. Each decision was a moral choice as much as a tactical one. Every move carried the weight of lives yet to be saved or lost. In those hours, March 17th, 1943, took on a new meaning. The day had begun with a shattering telegram declaring the fall of Stalingrad and the collapse of German hopes. But it had evolved into something else, a day of courage, resilience, and clandestine action. Klaus, Greta, and Fischer had become stewards of truth, acting decisively in a world dominated by lies and denial. By the early hours of March 20, the first tangible results of their efforts became evident. A small German unit, guided by the intelligence Klaus had transmitted, avoided encirclement and regrouped safely on the outskirts of the Don River. While the broader strategic situation remained grim, the act was a reminder that even in the darkest times, knowledge, foresight, and courage could make a difference. Klaus and his team allowed themselves a brief sigh of relief. The war would continue, the Reich would persist in its delusions, and countless lives would still be lost. But within the confines of their safe house, the spies had carved out a sanctuary of truth, a small rebellion of reason against the machinery of war. March 17 had begun as the day German spies realized the war was lost. By the close of Part 5, it had become a day of subtle victories, moral reckoning, and the recognition that courage and intelligence could bend history, if only in small but meaningful ways. The Gestapo's scrutiny had grown sharper with each passing day. Klaus Richter knew that remaining in Berlin, no matter how cautiously, was becoming a death trap. Reports from trusted couriers indicated that one of the newer agents had been questioned extensively, and the Abwehr's network of safe houses was slowly being compromised. Every step, every breath, every encrypted transmission carried mortal risk. The city, once a sanctuary of secrecy, had become a hunting ground. Klaus gathered Greta and Fischer in the dim light of their safe house. Maps and coded messages were spread across the table, each one a lifeline. "We move tonight," he said quietly. "Switzerland. It's the only place where we can ensure safety for ourselves and for the intelligence we carry." Greta's hands trembled slightly as she folded the latest intercepted messages into waterproof containers. "And the others?" she asked softly. "The couriers and agents we've relied on." Klaus's jaw tightened. "We have backup routes and secondary contacts. We cannot save everyone, but we can protect the network's core. That is all we can do." The rain had begun again, falling in cold sheets over the city, washing the cobblestones slick and glistening. Klaus and his team donned dark coats, hats pulled low, and began the careful navigation of Berlin's streets. Every shadow seemed alive, every passerby a potential threat. They avoided streetlights, ducked into alleyways, and used prearranged signals to communicate silently. Their first checkpoint was the Brandenburg Gate, normally teeming with activity, now eerily quiet in the late-night fog. Klaus led the way, scanning for Gestapo patrols, while Greta clutched a small satchel containing the most critical intelligence they had compiled. Fischer followed behind, his nerves taut but steady. Each step felt like walking across a precipice, every miscalculation potentially fatal. They reached the outskirts of the city, where a trusted courier awaited, with forged papers and a vehicle disguised for covert transport. Klaus quickly inspected the identification and documents before ushering Greta and Fischer into the back seat. The engine roared to life, blending with the steady drum of the rain, and they slipped into the darkness. Even as they drove, Klaus monitored radio frequencies, scanning for any trace of the Gestapo's presence. Reports from the safe house, as remaining network indicated that Berlin was tightening its grip, questioning more couriers, and tracking unusual transmissions. The city itself was closing in like a steel trap. Yet Klaus remained focused. One misstep, one signal too strong, one delayed stop, and any of these could expose them. Hours passed in tense silence, the car cutting through fog and empty highways. Greta finally broke the quiet, voice barely audible over the engine. "Do you think anyone will ever know what we did here?" Klaus, as eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Perhaps not. Perhaps only the soldiers whose lives we saved. Perhaps only history much later will understand." but it is enough to know that we acted. The journey took them through checkpoints manned by soldiers who had no knowledge of the intelligence they carried. Klaus relied on carefully timed pauses, falsified documents, and the courteous deference expected of those traveling late at night. Every interaction was a delicate dance, a balance between appearing ordinary and avoiding scrutiny. By dawn, they had crossed into neutral territory near the Swiss border. The rain had eased, and the first light of morning illuminated a landscape of rolling hills and misted valleys. Klaus allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. They were not yet safe. Pursuit could still be possible, but they had survived the immediate dangers of Berlin. As they settled in a small, inconspicuous village across the border, Klaus reviewed the intelligence one last time. "The Reich will continue to collapse," he said quietly, "but the units we've helped redirect, some of them may yet survive. That is the measure of our success." Greta nodded, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "We may not have stopped the war, but we've given people a chance. And in the end, that is what matters." Even as relief settled, the tension of the past days lingered like a shadow. The Gestapo would continue hunting spies. The Reich would persist in it. Delusions and soldiers at the Eastern Front remained at grave risk. But Klaus, Greta, and Fischer had survived, carrying with them not only documents and codes, but the moral weight of having acted on truth when the world demanded silence. Klaus knew that their escape was not merely a flight from danger. It was a continuation of their mission. From Switzerland, they could relay intelligence further, warn additional officers, and preserve the remnants of a network that had already altered outcomes on the Eastern Front. Their courage and skill had carved a fragile path through chaos, a lifeline for those who still depended on accurate knowledge in a world ruled by propaganda and denial. That night, in the quiet of their temporary refuge, Klaus finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the soldiers saved, of the messages successfully transmitted, of the risks narrowly avoided. March 17, 1943, the day German spies realized the war was lost, had now stretched into a sequence of critical actions, each step carrying them further from the Reich's reach. The next day, Klaus and Greta would continue their journey, moving through the Alps and neutral territory, coordinating with remaining couriers, and transmitting intelligence as cautiously as ever. The Gestapo might still pursue them, but the knowledge they bore was too important to abandon. Every mile of their flight was a moral and strategic victory, a testament to the courage and determination required to survive when the world demanded conformity and obedience. March 17 had begun as a day of revelation, a day of despair. By the close of Part 6, it had become a story of flight, cunning, and resilience. Klaus Richter, Greta Müller, and Fischer had navigated the razor edge between life and death, and though the Reich would continue its collapse, the intelligence they carried ensured that some lives would be spared, some truths preserved, and some acts of conscience remembered long after the guns fell silent. The Alps rose before them like jagged sentinels, snow-dusted and silent. Klaus Richter, Greta Müller, and Fischer moved cautiously through the mountain passes, carrying with them not only maps and encrypted messages, but the weight of history itself. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. After days of evasion and fear, the trio had crossed from Berlin's suffocating grip into relative safety. Yet, Klaus knew that survival was only the first part of their mission. The intelligence they carried remained a lifeline for officers still operating in the chaos of a crumbling wreck. As dawn painted the sky with pale gold, Klaus paused to survey the landscape. For the first time in nearly a week, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The world they had left behind, Berlin, Stalingrad, the Eastern Front, was still burning with the violence of war, the smoke of failing strategies, and the lies of propaganda. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, there was a fragile sense of hope. Greta adjusted her pack, her fingers brushing over the waterproof container that held the most critical intelligence. "Do you think anyone will ever understand what happened back there?" she asked quietly, voice barely rising above the whispering wind. Klaus shook his head. perhaps not. Perhaps only history, years from now, will see what we did. But it is enough that we acted, enough that some lives were saved, some truths preserved. Fischer, trudging behind them, muttered under his breath, "Sometimes I wonder if it really matters. The Reich will collapse anyway. We're just shadows chasing shadows." Klaus met his gaze, voice firm yet measured. "Shadows can illuminate the path. Without us, those who could have survived would have marched blindly into destruction. Every message we sent, every warning delivered, that is our proof. That is our impact." Crossing into Switzerland, they were met with the wary eyes of border officials, soldiers tasked with maintaining neutrality. Klaus presented the forged papers with a calm precision that belied the tension coiling in his chest. The officers inspected their documents, asked a few terse questions, and finally waved them through. For the first time since March 17, the spies felt the fragile relief of temporary safety. In the quiet of a small Swiss village, they took stock of their accomplishments. Every courier had survived, every message delivered or in transmission, every officer warned who could still act cautiously had received critical intelligence. Though Germany's defeat was inevitable, the moral victory was real. Lives had been spared, chaos had been mitigated, and a hidden record of truth had been preserved. Klaus allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. He thought of Stalingrad, of the soldiers trapped in the ruin, of the messages that had guided some units to safety. He thought of Greta, tireless and unwavering, whose skill and courage had made their mission possible. He thought of Fischer, whose pragmatism had balanced their moral decisions with the harsh realities of survival. Together, they had transformed despair into action, revelation into life-saving choices. As the day faded into evening, Klaus wrote a letter, a record for the future. He documented every critical step, every transmission, every perilous journey, and every choice they had made in the shadows of a collapsing Reich. It was not intended for immediate recognition. It was a testament to truth, a chronicle for historians who might one day understand the quiet courage of those who acted when the world demanded obedience. The letter, sealed and hidden, would survive the war, and one day it would be discovered, revealing that March 17, 1943, had been more than a date of despair. It had been a day of conscience, courage, and the subtle heroism of spies who dared to know the truth. Weeks later, reports filtered back from the Eastern Front. Some units had avoided encirclement, minor victories had slowed the enemy's advance, and countless soldiers had survived against the odds. Klaus read these reports with measured relief. Though the broader war remained a tragedy of monumental scale, their efforts had made a tangible difference. History would remember the battles, the generals, the grand strategies, but the hidden acts of bravery, the intelligence sent in secrecy, the lives quietly saved would remain until discovered. A hidden legacy of March 17. Klaus, Greta, and Fischer settled into the quiet life of exile. They remained connected to a few trusted operatives, sending intermittent intelligence to aid those still resisting or surviving in occupied Europe. Their work, though far from glamorous, had altered outcomes and ensured that some knowledge of truth persisted in the darkness of a collapsing regime. One crisp evening, Klaus stood outside their Swiss refuge, looking out over the snow-dusted valleys. He felt a profound weight lift from his shoulders. March 17, 1943, had begun with a telegram declaring the collapse of German forces, a day when spies realized the war was lost. It had ended with action, courage, and the preservation of life and truth. Though history would record the fall of Stalingrad and the failures of generals and dictators, it would not immediately capture the hidden network of bravery that had quietly intervened. Greta joined him, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Klaus shook his head. "Never. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, we chose action, we chose truth. And in that, there is victory." Fischer, standing a few paces away, added quietly, "Perhaps the war is lost, but we've won something far more enduring." Klaus nodded, gazing at the mountains. We've won conscience, courage. History may not see it yet, but someday it will. March 17, 1943, the day German spies first knew the war was lost, had begun with despair, fear, and revelation. By its end, it had become a testament to courage, intellect, and moral resolve in a world dominated by lies and violence. Klaus Richter, Greta Müller, and Fischer had transformed knowledge into action, despair into hope, and secrecy into survival. They had become the silent arbiters of history, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the guns fell silent, long after propaganda faded, and long after the Reich itself became a shadow in the pages of history. And as the Alps glimmered in the fading light of day, the three spies understood that while the war was lost, humanity had not been entirely defeated. Truth, courage, and conscience had survived.